You're right, everyone. So I had a bit of a weird one the past couple of weeks, which is why I look so disheveled. But I'm back and I'm ready to rock. So let's get into it. As the crises keep piling up for the fifth prime minister the UK has had in almost 10 years, I'm seeing a certain take on why we're going through prime ministers so quickly that the UK has become ungovernable, that the job of actually getting down to the hard task of doing regular, normal governing is just not possible. This has emerged because of the reignition of the Peter Mandelson scandal, which now seems like it will eventually be a fatal wound for an already weak government. I suspect this will be one of the central parts of the story after the local elections, which by the time this video is out will have happened. So the caveat here is, this is a prediction, but all signs point to Labour suffering a very severe set of losses across the country. Severe enough that it is possible, though I will say that we've been here before, and he's still there, that it will cause the final collapse of Keir Starmer's leadership. Local elections are often seen as a referendum on how the government is doing, and all indications point to the answer being badly, to put it very mildly. That combined with the high pressure on the government already may just about bring this to an end. In anticipation of this, journalists are starting to build the scaffolding of their post-Starmer analyses. And I was, for my sins, reading one by Andrew Marr, the editor of The New Statesman, who is himself a figure I would not have really associated with any kind of Labour-aligned thought as The New Statesman sort of pretends to be, but there you go. Maybe this is just The New Statesman embracing the fact that it is actually a centre-right publication at its very core. Who can say? It's their business, not mine. I saw the link, and the article was called "Should Keir Starmer Resign?", which you have to say is not a great sign for the Prime Minister, but one particular part of it jumped out at me, which said, once this crisis is over, there is an urgent conversation to be had about whether we have made the job of leading Britain impossible. I was left wondering who he meant by we, because there's two plausible readings. One is that he means we as in British journalists and the press, because this could be a reflection on how they've contributed to the imposition of at least two pretty obviously unsuitable prime ministers in the form of Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer through putting their thumbs on the scale in general elections, which would actually be an interesting thing to talk about. How responsible are the press in the UK for the inability of governments to govern? I think there's a case to be made, and I will make it, but that's not what I think Andrew Marr is trying to get at. Instead, I read it as the electorate or the public have made governing impossible. He doesn't really elaborate on his thoughts, so it's up to interpretation what exactly he meant by it. Instead, he decides to go into the topic of how Keir Starmer has utterly fucked it into the sun, which is fair enough. He has done that, and it is his article, not mine, so he doesn't have to talk about stuff that he doesn't want to talk about. I just thought it was interesting to throw it out there, almost like he's building this argument that he's going to return to later. Instead, I found my attention drawn to a different article that was a bit more explicit, which was by Zoe Williams in The Guardian. And she says very clearly who is to blame, where the crux of it is that the electorate is insufficiently grown up. They're unwilling to hear the cold, hard truths, and that if we've gone through so many prime ministers in such a short time, at some point something else must be going on. It can't just be that all the prime ministers are terrible. The subheading of the article is particularly interesting because it says, as Britons threaten to oust their fifth prime minister in 7 years, maybe voters need to ask themselves whether it's only the politicians who are to blame. And I was sitting there wondering, which Britons? She makes multiple references to the electorate, but in this period, the electorate has ousted exactly one prime minister, Rishi Sunak, and it's hard to say he didn't have it coming. But the rest were ousted or will be ousted by palace coups. To what extent does public opinion really make that happen? Is it the electorate imposing chaos onto the political class, or is it the political class being so incapable that chaos is the natural outcome? And that's what we're going to be getting into. To some extent, I am actually a little sympathetic to the notion because the UK is a place where nothing seems to work. In the minds of some people, we've gone through every viable governing philosophy. I mean, we gave both major parties landslide majorities, and still no governing appears to have happened. Things are getting worse every day. There's no clear sense of direction. More days where the government is in crisis than not. It's a complete mess. So, of course, the sensible types will look at things like the fact that the last Prime Minister to survive a full term was David Cameron, and that was in a coalition arrangement, and conclude that something has gone wrong. That public opinion of recent Prime Ministers tends to get extremely negative faster and faster. Superficially, when you take all of this in and you consider that successive governments have become paralyzed by the question of whether the Prime Minister is up for the job, there's maybe a case to answer. I'm just unconvinced it's the one that some people in the press and a certain type of very sensible home-owning centrist would like it to be. When I hear the term ungovernable, I have to admit that the UK doesn't come to mind. As far as I can tell, outside of the fantasies of AI slot-driven far-right derangement, the UK government is able to enforce its will across all of its territory. Admittedly, the British government does operate in the law is powerless to help you, not powerless to punish you way, but the government can do things if it feels like doing them. There's nothing we in the general public are particularly doing that means the government, which I will remind people has a landslide majority in the House of Commons, can't do whatever it thinks it ought to be doing. I don't want to name specific countries, but you can probably think of a few that are more credibly described as ungovernable. The UK, a middling and declining state in the middle of the global north, is not really comparable to a lot of the countries that would come to mind if I said ungovernable to you. An ungovernable country would not hand two different parties landslide majorities at back-to-back elections, then see the people who led their parties to those victories ousted by a combination of press pressure, their own incompetence, scandal, and their parliamentary parties abandoning them. This presumes Starmer will eventually be ousted. Maybe it's already happened by the time you're watching this. We can only hope. My point is, if the electorate or the public was making Britain ungovernable, why do they seem desperate to be governed and angry at a consistent inability to govern across party lines? Let's take the example of Keir Starmer's loveless landslide at the 2024 election. Regardless of how we feel about the fact that a party won 33% of the vote and won so many seats, the fact is that enough people in the right places elected Labour MPs to give the current government a huge majority. We can debate the reasons why they did that and why so many of these voters seem to have abandoned them, but I think at least part of the answer lies in, or to be more precise, on the Labour 2024 manifesto. An image of a man with a single word next to him: change. It's a very simple and very effective message and sets expectations for that government quite nicely. If you vote for us, you get Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, which, again, as of recording, check, that's still true, and you get change. Less true. A lot less true. Despite the manifesto itself suffering from a lot of the problems that every party manifesto suffers from, intentional vagueness, a desperation to thread a needle that's no longer there, and specific to this one, no real unifying vision in what change is other than just sort of not doing the things you think are bad and trying to do the things that you think are good, which would be a solid basis for governing in the UK. I don't think it's a full parliament's worth of stuff, but just not doing things that harm the country on purpose would be a change and one that everyone would likely welcome. Instead, what we have is largely a government that has taken the most egregious parts of its predecessor's platform, particularly the bigotry and the support of genocide, and that has abandoned or is seeking to abandon the parts of its platform that would be the clearest symbols of change. Which leads me to ask, what part of that is the electorate's fault? So far as I can tell, the electorate voted to give Starmer a majority so big that he could basically do whatever he wanted. The famous line from one of my other videos was that he could pass legislation to banish Mr. Blobby to the moon. And I frankly think it's cowardice on his part that he hasn't already done it. To return to the serious point, Starmer's time in office has been ineffectual, riddled with gaffes, scandals, and hasn't really represented any change in the way the public feel about the country. That it's going in the wrong direction, that we're poorer, that we're more detached from the decisions being made, and that governments aren't able to stop creating scandals so large that they engulf any space that might be left for a bit of governing. To link it to the recent scandal, did the electorate pick Peter Mandelson to be ambassador to America and cause the government to be engulfed in a scandal that created the sense of crisis and a government out of control? Or did Keir Starmer do it? Whoever did it seems more responsible for this sense that Britain is ungovernable than the other party. I find it very difficult to believe in the Zoe Williams hypothesis that it's the electorate behind this inability to govern for the reasons I raised before, but also because outside of elections, the British electorate is pretty irrelevant. If you look at public opinion and what policies the government and opposition largely support, it doesn't take long to find some pretty significant gaps. That's not to say the British public is always right about everything. In fact, the British public wrong about everything headline is from 2013, so this isn't even news to a lot of us. What I mean is, agree or disagree with what the British public say they want. On a lot of the issues where the most difference would be made to people's lives, the political mainstream does not align with them. You might then say, what about protests? Don't those have some impact? And, maybe, but firstly, I would point to successive British governments clamping down on protests, making it harder and making it more dangerous. And secondly, I would point to the most famous example of a mass protest by the British public, which was the protest against the Iraq War. You will note, we still went into Iraq. Labour may have suffered political consequences as a result of that, but the policy ended up being the opposite of what people wanted anyway, despite mobilising so many people. To the extent that public opinion can oust prime ministers, it's either at a general election, which has only been the fate of one of our recent prime ministers in Rishi Sunak. The others were ousted or will be ousted by what I said before, which is palace coups. The MPs are the ones who decide, and they might cite public opinion as the reason. For example, when they oust Keir Starmer, the local elections will have happened, but they haven't happened as of recording. This is really confusing. I feel like I'm doing weird time travel stuff now. But it will likely be cited as one of the reasons to oust him, that the public are fed up with him, but the truth is that it will be a combination of embarrassing the press with the Mandelson stuff and his general incompetence when they backed him up so much, and his own MPs getting sick of defending him. Not entirely dissimilar to the downfall of Boris Johnson in that regard. All it took was the right people being fed up with him, and then suddenly public opinion could be wielded as a cudgel, or I would say used as a scapegoat for the chaos that's inevitably inflicted by a change of prime minister, which is what this notion that the electorate has made Britain ungovernable looks like. A group of people trying to find someone convenient to blame that means they don't have to actually interrogate what's wrong. As I said earlier, I'm not completely unsympathetic to the notion that Britain is ungovernable, and I can see how you would come to that conclusion on your own. So if that's where you are, I promise I'm not shitting on you, because it's the obvious conclusion to draw about a country where the government feels illegitimate, nothing works, and there's an increasing tension in day-to-day life, whether it's the cost of living or the fact that the far right are on the march, which is, apparently not a noteworthy thing for our Prime Minister to comment on. But, that's a separate matter for a separate video, perhaps. I want to offer a slightly different hypothesis, which is that Britain isn't ungovernable, but has been left ungoverned for a long time, and attempts to govern have generally been done poorly. I'll refer back to that Simpsons reference I made earlier. It really does feel like the government is powerless to help you, but not powerless to punish you. So it's very clear that the government can do things if it wants. So why does it want to do the things that everyone seems to hate? I talked about this in another video, which you should check out, but the common thread between the Conservatives and Labour, who we've both handed landslide majorities to, is that the quality of MPs in those parties is terrible, especially after their landslides. If you look at the Tories' 2019 intake, it's not surprising that things devolved into farce and that we had MPs making videos about Easter decorations in supermarkets going up early. Now, to be fair, that MP is from the 2010 intake, but he is spiritually from the 2019 intake. To say nothing of the Labour Party's own terrible intake in 2024, which seems to have largely been vetted by either Morgan McSweeney or Peter Mandelson, but in either case really highlights the problem. And I did talk about some of these candidates before the election, like Luke Akehurst, a man who got into a fight with a child's birthday party and who thinks nuclear weapons can be used as a warning shot, which is not how that works, really. Which perhaps explains why these 10 or so years of chaos have also coincided with multiple panics about party members getting to pick their candidates. You can't get quality like Luke the Nuke otherwise. The problem isn't the government's ability to do things. It's about the caliber of person we end up with as MP, because there's a system of patronage, and it's notoriously quite difficult to unseat incumbent MPs internally within their own party. We're not like America. We don't have open primaries, right? Especially if they're in Labour, which means unless you vote these people out, you might be stuck with some useless middle manager as your MP for 30 years. And if you've ever worked a corporate job, you'll understand what I mean when I say that there's a type of person who values the appearance of doing something more than actually doing something. And that seems to be who our political system elects. Is it any wonder that they then go on to either do nothing, or when their hands are forced, they do something that makes no sense or makes the problem worse? Our political class is not really equipped to even try governing, which I would say is the first step to actually determining if Britain is or isn't ungovernable. Give it a try, see what happens. Maybe we'd be surprised if we actually tried something once. To go back to that Andrew Marr article, while I can't say for sure what he meant by that line, where he says we need to have a serious discussion about this, if you decided that what he meant was the British press, well, that would actually be correct, at least partially correct, and surprising, because it would challenge an industry that notoriously deals very poorly with criticism. The press do act as a filter on who gets to be an MP and who gets to be treated like a legitimate political force in this country. You need only look at the outrage that Zach Polanski has generated, which has resulted in a number of anti-Semitic caricatures of him featuring in national newspapers, which seems bad to be controversial, but it's all part of the press's role in selecting who gets to make the decisions that matter, or not make those decisions, as is more often the case. That's the side of it that I and a lot of people on, our side of the political spectrum, if I might be so bold, tend to focus on, because it's the one that we're on the receiving end of more often than not. But there is a mirror to this, which is that the press often builds up these politicians, allows them to construct personas that make them palatable to some part of the electorate, and that the press will treat as authentic, no matter how obviously false they are. They do this for a number of routes. I'm just going to pick a few examples out of the air. One is allowing them to build a persona through light entertainment or comedy, outright and barely concealed propaganda, and through totally refusing to scrutinize them. You will note none of these actually helps us, the public, decide who is actually suitable for the job before they get it, which you would think is a helpful thing for the press to do. Provide us with enough information to make that choice. And it's rich to see parts of the press turn around and blame the electorate for making decisions with bad or incomplete information. Information they provided, often on behalf of the politicians they're helping dupe people. Not all people, but enough people to make a difference. A lot of this Britain is ungovernable talk looks like journalists trying to blame someone else for a mess they had a hand in creating. It's easier to blame the British public, and God knows that I love blaming the British public for stuff, I can't blame them. But it's easier to blame them than it is to actually challenge the structures that impose these useless politicians onto us. The unsurprising thing in all of this is that it doesn't lead to a particularly good governing, which can look an awful lot like the country is refusing to be governed once that implodes upon contact with reality, or that governing is just an impossible challenge. I'm not saying that I think governing is easy, especially a country like the UK, which has a lot of varied demands and needs across it. I'd wager it's harder to govern the UK than it is to do my job. But it can't possibly be as hard as the governments we have make it look. Again, is it the electorate or the public's fault that successive governments fall into death spirals, usually because their conduct has become so egregious that it takes up all the space where any attempt to govern would usually go? I find it too convenient, and I am a pessimist in a lot of ways about the British public. They haven't made the best decisions, or decisions that I would agree with, at any election or major nationwide vote that I've ever voted in. So you could say they're the ones who put the people there. Sure, but that's an argument that applies to maybe two of the occasions that are relevant to this in the past 12 years. To blame the public either by saying that they're too fickle or they don't want to hear the uncomfortable truths about what needs to be done in Britain is getting it the wrong way round. It's holding the electorate to account for the mistakes of the political and media classes, which is their specialty, but I'm just not buying it. Maybe if we'd had people who earnestly tried to govern in a way that wasn't just brazen attempts to harm the most vulnerable while enriching themselves, we could have this conversation. But again, the press kind of stops those people from getting into those positions. And we didn't have that happen, so we shouldn't have this conversation. Instead, I would say it's useful to look at the press and the political class's mutual benefit in all of this. That they clearly share an interest is bad enough, but it's clear politicians like being flattered, because, who doesn't? I like being flattered. I'm only human. And that the press enjoys being able to make and unmake senior politicians at will. You need only look at the glee they have when they think they're bayoneting a corpse like Starmer, or how much they love screaming at anyone to their left. They're having the time of their lives, which makes me think any articles we've seen or will likely see about how ungovernable Britain is just them deflecting from their own fault in this. I promise you, it's less our fault than it is the fault of politicians, and anyone trying to convince you otherwise should be treated with suspicion. And with that, I'm officially back. Yay, next time I'll be much neater and much nicer. But for now, I'm back. With that, everyone, I need to thank my proofreader who is also back. She's having to proofread my scripts again because they exist suddenly. She was delighted, in case anyone was asking. Also, a special shout out to the patrons and members. But before we do that, remember to like, comment, subscribe. all the good stuff. Make sure you do all of that if you like the video. And also, now, patrons and members get the shout out if you want the videos early, if you want to vote on the topic of the videos, all of that good stuff. You know, the usual benefits that people get for Patreon and YouTube membership. Join the Patreon and YouTube membership, patreon.com/SKTheCrusader. They've been very patient with me, and this month is shaping up to be quite a big month. And then June and July somehow are shaping up to be even bigger months, especially July, if things proceed as I have planned. Fingers crossed. But if you're a top tier patron or a YouTube member, you get the shout out. So shout out to the top tier patrons: Jerome Riff, Kazli Scheider, John N, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and Carolyn. Thank you to them, and to the YouTube members: Nada Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Ben Johnson. All of you are absolute legends. I love you so much. Thank you for being patient with me while I've not just been like physically unwell, but also kind of been going through it. It turns out surviving the massive catastrophe that is my birthday doesn't mean I was doing fine, actually. It turns out there may have been some residual effects that I didn't see coming. But how could we have known? How could we have known? Anyway, everyone, thank you for sticking with me through this one. I will catch you all on the next one, which will hopefully be in a couple weeks. And until then, feel free to let me know whether Starmer has been successfully ousted or not. I don't know. I'm SK from the past, and I'm going to keep the editing SK interventions to a bare minimum because, truthfully, most of this is being edited before the local election results are out. So, yeah. All right, everyone. Take it easy. I will see you in the next one. Peace.